How we doing, NAGDCA? We doing okay today? Oh my God, I played in so many punk bands, I guess I couldn't hear you because you were so excited. I didn't hear you. I said, are we ready for a good time today? Okay, wonderful. What I'm here to talk about is the most powerful human invention. And so when we leave this room in about 60 minutes, if you believe one thing, I've accomplished my goal. And that one thing is that storytelling is actually the most powerful human invention. I'll say it again. Storytelling is actually the most powerful human invention. And they may sound a little weird right now, but I promise you we'll get you there. The second thing we're going to do is actually equip you with some real tools so that you can take storytelling and apply it in your lives. Does that sound okay? Oh my goodness, that was the most quiet. Are we in New Orleans or in, like Missouri, where Cindy's from? Sorry, I'm from Iowa, so I can pick on these people. All right, let's do this. Anybody familiar with this mountain range right here? If you are, you are a master geologist. This is the Al Sarawat mountain range. It's in Saudi Arabia. Has anybody ever heard of that? Raise your hand. Wow, you are well-traveled individuals. You may know this story. The Al Sarawat mountain range, interesting fact, it actually extends from the northern border that hits Jordan all the way down to Yemen. It's about 1,000 miles long. And if you think about what this means for the country of Saudi Arabia, for most of its existence, this mountain range actually divided the country into two parts. And so right on the Red Sea, which you can see over the horizon there, there's a thin sliver of land, a very vibrant community. And then on the rest of the country, there's a lot of desert, and Mecca is over on that side. Okay, why are we talking about it? Because when you're divided from a major body of water like the Red Sea, it can really impair your economy. And so there was a king in the 60s named King Faisal who came into power. And he had one goal, one legacy that he wanted to leave for his country, and that was to unite the kingdom, to build a road from Mecca to the Red Sea. And it may not seem like a big deal now, but it's only 50 miles across the desert, and then you have to get over the mountain range. But at the time, it was an insurmountable engineering problem. But Saudi Arabia had a lot of money, and so King Faisal said, basically, any international construction firm, please come here, you name the price, and you can build this road across the Red Sea. So he gave people a blank check, and firms from all around the globe came in. And they started to survey the land and try and think about how they could do it. And believe it or not, despite the fact that money was no object, there was no international firm that was able to bid the project. And the reason was because that's solid granite right there. So even if you could think about how to get your equipment to the base of the mountain, getting up and over and building a road in the 60s was not really something that most firms felt comfortable doing. Very risky from both a safety perspective, but then also just the ability to complete the job. But then even if you got up and over the mountains, you still have 50 miles of desert to build a road through. And so the king was pretty defeated when he didn't get anybody to bid on this contract. And his legacy, which he had sort of celebrated with people, was at risk. But then, of course, all great stories, but then there's a hero that comes along, right? There's a man, and he actually ran a local firm, a ragtag bunch of construction folks who came in and said, we will build the road from Mecca to the Red Sea in 2 years for a very modest budget. The king absolutely thought he was crazy, but he had no other option, and he said, fine, go build the road. And so now the question was, how does a ragtag bunch of construction people get all of their earth movers, bulldozers, and big equipment across 50 miles of desert to the base of the mountains? Well, you can't just drive across. So what they did is they disassembled those earth movers, they put them on the backs of donkeys and camels, and they caravanned those parts through the desert and got to the base of this mountain range. Once they got there, they reassembled the equipment. Then they took those same donkeys and followed them as they walked up and over the mountain range because they knew that donkeys instinctually would find the path of least resistance. They marked that path and then they blasted it with dynamite, built the road over the course of 16 months, living on the side of that mountain range over to the Red Sea, and then focused for the next 4 months on building incremental chunks across the desert until they got to Mecca. And in so doing, they united their kingdom. They became national heroes, and the king was just so excited. And the question I have for you is, how did this bunch of people who were technologically ill-equipped compared to all those international firms, they did not have the experience to do a job at this scale, how did they do the thing that no firm would sign up to do? And the answer, you know I'm going to say now, is story. Because if you think about what's the story that drives an international construction firm when they're bidding a job like this, the story is exclusively about money, and it's about risk. Money and risk are very analytical, and they do not drive you to do impossible things. If you look at every great achievement in human history, it was not driven by money or the aversion of risk. What it was driven by was a dream in something bigger than yourself. And so let's think about the story for that firm in Saudi Arabia. What it meant for them was the ability to provide a new economic future for their country. Because now, with access to the Red Sea, we could really take exports to the next level. And so to have the opportunity to play that part in your own country's history, wow, that's incredible. And that story drove them to do whatever it took to get the job done. And so what we're going to talk about for the next hour is how that happens, how story actually makes us do impossible things. And we'll even talk about how it's related to retirements. So here's the road. Very believable that a donkey rode this path. And by the way, from an engineering perspective, this road is in incredible shape. They really did an impeccable job. Okay, so what does this mean? Let's get big picture. Every great human achievement is born from a great story. Every great human achievement is born from a great story. All right, let's talk about why. Let's talk about the history of this. And when I say the history of this, I mean the history of our species. So, plus or minus a few 100,000 years, humans have been alive for roughly 2 million years, if you count our early modern ancestors. Okay, so where are we going with this, Matt? Where we're going is the fact that for most of those 2 million years of our existence, we were not significant. We were mid-level primates. So just like all of our other chimpanzee and ape cousins, we lived in small groups. We were subject to a number of different threats, whether it was giant kangaroos, cave bears, saber-toothed tigers, or disease. And we focused exclusively on survival. And so why is this interesting and important? It's interesting and important because we're no longer those mid-level primates. We now rule the world. We are the top of every single food chain. We can dominate movement across this globe. We can build whatever we want. And the question is, how did we do that? There were all these other primates that were right where we were. How did we take ourselves and put ourselves in a place where we're ruling the world? Well, that happened roughly 70,000 years ago. 70,000 years ago, one of our early modern ancestors discovered that if you put food over fire, it's actually easier to chew. That may have been as complicated as the whole process got, but they did that. And in so doing, they were able to eat a lot more food. And with that additional food, they got themselves more nutrients, which brought their brains to life and gave them new cognitive capabilities. And for tomorrow's keynote on the behavioral economics and all that stuff, I'm sure you'll be talking a lot about brain science, but this is exactly what happened. So what was the most important new cognitive capability we got? Language. Okay. What could we do with language? We could tell stories about who we are, about what we're here to do, and about how we're going to do it. Okay. So now we're a species that can tell stories that shape who we are. And what that does, and this is the most important point about this, what that does is enables cooperation at scale. So if you look at all other animal species, nobody can cooperate in groups of roughly 100 or more. We, though, can now take story and cooperate in the hundreds, the thousands, the billions. Because we can take story to construct an identity over who we are, what we're here to do, and how to do it. And so if you look at how all great religions are spread, story. Anybody read the Bible? The Quran, any of the groups, how do we communicate the most important ideas in our history through the story of other people? And so that's why you can use story for your purposes too. Okay, let's talk about a few examples. 1980. Anybody watch this game? Yeah? Miracle on Ice. You have to be careful. I worked in the Pentagon for 5 years, so I'm really heavy on Cold War examples. But let's talk about this story here. Youngest team in Olympic history, youngest men's hockey team, entirely composed of amateur athletes from college, going up against a whole slew of really qualified teams, and the most qualified of them being the Soviet Union, which was all professional athletes, and they had won 5 out of the last 6 gold medals. So going into the 1980 Olympics in Lake Placid, they were just like that construction crew going across the desert to Mecca. Nobody thought they could do it. And then if you look at what actually happened, we all know the story now. They won a game, they tied a game, they came up against the Soviet Union, they beat them, and they eventually won gold medal. Al Michaels is screaming into the microphone, "Do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in miracles?" And it's one of the most inspirational things, and if you've ever seen either the live footage or the movie that depicts it, it is incredible. But the question is, how did they do it? And if you know, actually Herb Brooks gave them a speech right before the game, and he said, if we played them 10 times, we'd lose 9. But tonight, we are the best hockey team in the world. And for them, being the best hockey team in the world wasn't about a medal, it was about something much bigger. Because in 1980, we were at a second height of the Cold War. We were in a position where we were at risk, once again, of going to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And ideologically, we were in a place where we were actually having to prove that democracy was a viable model for the road ahead. Because communism was on the rise once again. And so for them, that game was not about hockey, it was about the future of this country. And it may seem sort of over just focus on the patriotism in this, but it really was true. They were there for a much bigger story. Whereas the Soviet Union, we're here to win our 6th gold medal out of 7 visits to the Olympics. And so we did it. Next example, 1962, September. JFK comes into a stadium at Rice University. Anybody from Texas? Okay, you guys are I'm not really sure you're from Texas because you're very quiet. I expected a more boisterous thing, but no. Anybody from Texas? Rice University. It's a hot September day. JFK gets in there in 1962, and he announces that within 10 years, we're going to not only build a spacecraft that's capable of getting to the moon, but it's actually going to drop a human being on the moon and return them safely back to Earth. Pretty audacious claim, given the fact that the Soviet Union was far ahead of us in the space race. And most of the people that were going to be doing this actually didn't know that that's what was going to be happening. And so then the question is, how do we accelerate ourselves to a place where we did that? We didn't do it in 10 years, we did it in 7. And JFK was gone, but his legacy lived through that. And it came down to story. Because if you look at what NASA was doing, and what the hundreds of thousands of people who went in on this job were thinking about, it wasn't how can I build a cool rocket ship. It was how can I shape the future of what people see when they see America. And that's powerful. And that type of story can fuel great things. All right, one more example. Let's get out of the Cold War and into the scientific community. Researchers found an amber with a mosquito and it had blood in it. Inside that blood, there was a DNA sample from a dinosaur. They had an idea, maybe we could bring back all of the prehistoric creatures that we ever experienced, and so they did, and they brought back all the major dinosaurs and made the most incredible theme park in world history. Do we know this story? We do. My wife is like, get that slide out of there, you're not a funny guy. So, okay. Why does storytelling work? Okay, here's the deal. I might give you a pass on this one. Let's get back to brain science. Why is story the most powerful human invention? We talked about all the history and all of the sort of inspirational stuff that can come into it, but it's actually a little bit deeper than that. Story is powerful because of the impact it has on our brains. And so this is a point when usually I go into the crowd and I look for whatever poor soul is making eye contact with me. This is a moment everybody's like this. And I do an interactive thing. But I'm going to spare you that today. And the only reason I am is because Tracy might get stressed out if I walked out there, and I don't think it would be good. So I'm going to tell you a story, and then we're going to watch what happens to our brains, okay? It was January 2015. My wife and I had been approved to become foster parents. It took about like 9 weeks of training, but for us it was a long journey. It was about a year of deciding to do it, to get it hooked up with the state, to go through the training, to get the home visits done and everything. And then in January 2015, we got a call. It was 5 p.m. There were 2 girls, 3 and 7. And those 2 girls were originally from Richmond, but they were living with their grandma down in North Carolina. And their mom had fallen victim to the opioid crisis, and so they were living with grandma because that was the only suitable home for them. And we got the call, and they said, grandma's home is actually not suitable. So there's a state employee who's driving down to North Carolina right now to take those kids away. Will you take them in? Well, that's pretty scary, but this is what we waited for. This is why we did it, and so we said, absolutely. And they said, it's going to be late because they're going all the way down to North Carolina and coming straight back. So what happened? At 3 a.m. that night in January, it was cold, 2 girls came in with no coats on. They were absolutely petrified. And it's kind of a weird thing, but when you get foster kids, and especially if it doesn't matter if it's middle of the night, actually most of these things happen in the middle of the night, you have to sign paperwork. And so you have to sit with a social worker while the kids are there to say, okay, I'm assuming temporary custody, all this stuff. And while we were doing that, those 2 girls were sitting on a bench in our kitchen, and they were just huddled up next to each other, so scared. And it's the most powerful moment that I saw when I just looked at them and I saw the innocence that they had gone through and what their lives had been up to this point. And we found out shortly after that that was actually the 3-year-old's birthday. And she was carrying a stuffed animal that her grandmother had given her. Because for them, even though the home was not suitable, they still loved their parents and their grandparents. Okay, this is tough. So I'm going to pause here before I say anything more and talk about what's happening to our brains. When we tell stories, even sad ones or happy ones or anything like that, our brains are really snapping into gear. What happens? There's a hormone in our brains that's called oxytocin. It's casually referred to as the cuddle hormone. Don't worry, we're not going to be cuddling anybody. But what it does is it enables cooperation. Because when oxytocin starts flowing, when we hear somebody tell a story, we want to support them in that journey. And so when I was telling you this story about these 2 girls, if I had then followed up right now and said, by the way, we need help. We need a crib. We need anything. We need clothes. We don't have any clothes. We need all sorts of things that go into being a parent when you're a first-time parent. And if I had said that right now and this was just happening, you all would spring into gear in a way that you wouldn't have necessarily otherwise. Because when you hear a story, oxytocin kicks in, and you want to help out to advance to the end of that story. That's the brain science. And so now, since I've got you on a hook here, let me tell you what happened with the 2 girls. The 2 girls took all of 30 minutes, and it was the most bizarre thing ever. We're reading a bedtime story at 3:30 a.m. They were excited, and we started a journey with them that was one of the most powerful experiences in our lives. And those 2 girls today are doing great. And despite some issues with homework, mostly on the parent side, we're having a blast. So no need for any of the stuff that we're going to need. But when we tell stories like that, oxytocin kicks in. Okay? Great. How does storytelling work? Okay. How does storytelling actually work? And this is where we're going to get a little bit more practical. A little bit more feet on the ground and less human history. Storytelling is really an interesting way, and I think what we should do is talk about it. So there's a man who went to the University of Chicago after World War II. He was actually a prisoner of the Germans, and then when the war was finally over, he got out. He came with the GI Bill, went to the Midwest, went to the University of Chicago, and because of everything that he had witnessed during World War II, he decided that he would study anthropology because he was super fascinated by human beings at this point in time and what they were capable of. Okay, so that man went through, and at the time, the University of Chicago had a combined program where you could actually get your bachelor's and master's and just mash it up into 1 degree. So he finished his work on his bachelor's degree, and all was good. The only deal was you actually didn't get a bachelor's degree until you got your master's degree. And so, no bachelor's degree, okay, and goes on to get his master's degree straight into it. Good student, pretty good writer, and put together his thesis that he needed to graduate. And if anybody's done a PhD or a master's thesis, you know that by the time you come to your committee, we're basically at rubber stamp phase, because they've already given you, traditionally, most of the feedback that you're getting. Well, for this man, not so much, because he wasn't necessarily listening to any of the feedback that he was getting for his committee, and he just kept his thesis as it was. So when he got to the point where he was actually putting it forward to the committee for approval, they rejected it. They said, nope, no degree for you. Bring it back and do exactly what we told you to do the first time. And he said, okay, I got it this time. And he brought it back a second time, and he didn't change a thing. They rejected it again. Okay, who was that man? Anybody know who that is? Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut, now one of the most famous authors in certainly American history. By the way, quick pause. Of all the things that Cindy mentioned too about the magic of New Orleans, and it is one of the most historic cities there ever was, this is an incredible literary town. So when you're down in the French Quarter, you can walk over and see Tennessee Williams' house where he wrote A Streetcar Named Desire. You can see Faulkner's house where he wrote his very first novel. And you can go to a hotel where Hemingway, Capote, Faulkner, and a whole slew of others actually wrote books inside. So while you're out and about exploring, check it out. Most of them are around Royal Street, but then, you know, it's all in the French Quarter. Anyway, Kurt Vonnegut had that thesis, didn't get his degree, and walked away. And hadn't written any books or anything at the time. But the reason we're talking about this is because of what that thesis actually said. That thesis said that all great stories have a similar shape. All great stories have a similar shape. Okay. And good thing he didn't balk on this one, because this actually became the most profound thing that he ever created. And by the way, right before he died, he said, my prettiest contribution to this culture was that thesis. And of course, the University of Chicago, right after he wrote Cat's Cradle, was like, absolutely, here's your honorary degree. We got you, we love you. This is a proud alum of the university. But he held strong because he believed that this was one of the most important truths that there ever was. And it turns out he was right. So if you look at how we tell stories and construct stories, and how Hollywood in particular does it, there are 4 key elements. There's a character, in pursuit of a goal, facing a big challenge, and finding success. And what Vonnegut said, which I think still holds true, is this is just an exercise in relativity. And so it's the peaks and valleys that really intrigue us the most. When we transition from the low points where everything feels bleak, when you're sitting for 16 months on the side of a mountain and it's really hard life, but you realize that you might find success. It's those moments where we go from the lowest of the low to the highest of the high that we are addicted to as a species. And so whether it's Cinderella or Harry Potter or any number of other famous stories, they all follow a similar shape. And actually, in the time since Vonnegut, we've developed an AI capability so you can actually map stories. And what we found is, and not we, but the real smart people who did all the algorithms, is they found that this is largely bearing out if you look at best-selling movies and things like that. And so knowing this, for folks like you, is important, because the way that you communicate, whether it's in words or in writing, to your people, when you're trying to help them understand their world, and retirement and defined contributions and all of the complexities that go into heavily regulated things like that, and things that require people's attention in a space where it's not the most popular topic, I'm sure, in most of your workplaces. If you know this, there's a way that you can actually increase engagement with what you want to talk about. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of today talking about. Sound good? Okay, good. So what does this have to do with defined contributions? Boy, we really went on a ride, didn't we? We went through 2 million years of human history. We did a couple of Cold War stops. We got Vonnegut in there. And so now we need to talk about you. Because at the end of the day, this is your story, not ours. So, story is actually your secret weapon. Okay. So, there are 4 things that you can do to master storytelling. And so, by the way, let me hit pause here, because a keynote is never going to fully equip you with everything you need to be the next Tolstoy, which actually, Tolstoy, does anybody read Tolstoy? Oh, you all are smart. Of course you're sitting in the third row. What about in back? Anybody reading Tolstoy back there? Yeah, that's right. I'm with you back there. Tolstoy, we'll give a prop since we got 2 fans in the audience. But this isn't about you becoming the next great literary genius. What it is about is a really practical way to equip you with the skills so that you can create your own stories that have the same shape as all the great ones. So the first thing you can do is start with why. When you're communicating with anybody inside of your organization, or frankly anybody in your life, the most powerful thing you can do if you're trying to persuade them is start with why you're doing this. And so let's look at an example. Anybody read the book by any of Simon Sinek's books? This is straight from him. He's written a lot about the power of why. And what he did is he put together an example here of a sample elevator pitch from Apple computers. So when you look at the side on your left there, and it says, basically, we make great computers, okay. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one. It doesn't actually sound that bad, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's telling you about what's differentiating about Apple computers, and it's at least celebrating the aspects of the computer that are great. But the problem is, with that left side there, we're only engaging the neocortex part of the brain. The neocortex is the language processing part of the brain. And so basically when we read that or hear that or anything, we say, yeah, sounds good. But because it's in that neocortex part of the brain, it's only going to last maximum 2 days. And then ask me in 3 days what I think about Apple computers. I'll be like, oh, I think I talked to somebody about that. And that is not going to be what you need to do. So if you're sending emails or communicating with people in town hall meetings or anything like that, and you start with, hey, we've got a great option for you for retirement, and let me tell you a little bit about defined contributions, and here's what you need to do to really get engaged, to set yourself up for a financial future. That sounds great, but people will forget it almost instantly, and at most 2 days later. So what could you do? Start with why. Why are you in this business? So think about it. In everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. Okay, this might seem abstract, but in doing that, you create not just a brand that sells products, but now you're creating a culture around what you do. And then you get to a place where you say, the way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers, want to buy one. Starting with why engages not the neocortex, but the limbic system in the brain. The limbic system is where we get our gut instinct and our trust. So if you can start with why with your audience, you will engage a different part of the brain, which may and should influence their decisions. Okay. Second thing you can do, listen for their story. Human beings, we love to tell our story, but we're not always the best when we're telling other people's. And this is one of the most powerful things you can do, is actually put them as the main character in the story that you're telling. So, first question that you need to ask is, who is their main character? For most of you, it's going to be the person you're talking to, the person who's actually going to be in control of their own benefits and all that stuff. But there's a reason this is on there, and that's because sometimes their main character is not them. Sometimes it's their children, or sometimes it's their wife, or any number of other people in their lives who may be, in their eyes, more important to them when they think about retirement than anyone else. So your goal is to understand, who are they in this for? Are they in this for themselves, their family? What is it? Because when you know that, then you can think about them as the main character on a journey. And so what's the journey? Then you have to think about, what goals are they pursuing? Not what you think is a good idea for the long term, but what goals are they actually concerned about? Because if you know that, like when they envision themselves up 40 years in the future or 30 years in the future, what do they see? And what's interesting is a lot of people don't look that far in the future, as you all know. And I know there's something I was talking with Cindy about where, like my dad, he used to work for Principal, and so he was so pumped that we were coming here today. And he was like, man, you got to tell them that they're spending more time booking their vacations than they are thinking about their retirement. I was like, Dad, they know this stuff already. They're living it. But that's the thing where you might not even have people who are seeing this. And so you can really understand, what are they in this for? So that you can start to reframe the way you communicate. And then the last thing is, what challenges are they facing? So you know their goals, but then what are the uphill battles that they're facing? And when you think about that in the context of that curve that I showed you, once you know who the main character is, and then you get to a place where you understand their goals, but they're facing a challenge, then you can be the one that helps them find the ending they don't see. Find the ending to the story that they don't see. And so this is a situation where now that you've positioned yourself, where you started with why are you in this business, to really shift the conversation out of some tactical, transactional thing into a place where they understand there's a reason that Ronnie sits for 40 years. And by the way, Ronnie, how many years have you actually been in the business? 1967? Thank you, by the way, for allowing me. You've already been on the spot, though. So, since 1967. So, Ronnie's seen some stuff. And by the way, you should be up here, not me, because I thought your acceptance was amazing. But Ronnie's seen some stuff. And the question is, over those years, he's seen generations of people who've gone through retirement. And so he knows something because in 1960, let's say 1968, you got your first batch of folks who are retiring. Those people started work as early as, I don't know, 1945, in World War II era. And so he's picking up all the insights from those people who are reflecting back on their journey. And then the next year, and the next year, and the next year, and he's got 40 plus years of knowledge of people who are looking backwards. And when you're looking backwards, it's a lot different than looking forwards. Because that's when we start to say, oh, wait a minute, I'm not sure I should have done that. And so if I were working where Ronnie is, the first thing that I would do is say, Ronnie, tell me what I don't know. Because he knows what I don't know. He sees what I don't see. Is that true, Ronnie? Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. The guy is a king, so of course he knows. So what do you know about their retirement that they don't? And see, now here's the trick, right? You've gone to a place where you started with why, and then you understood their story. And this is key. Because if Ronnie led with, you don't know anything, kid, what you need to do is just go with this and just sign right here, we're good. That would not work very well for me or a lot of other people. But once he's in a spot where he's thinking about me, and he's seen people who have similar situations to me, now he knows what story he's going to tell when I'm asking questions about defined contributions. Or, worst case, I'm not even asking questions, but I should be. Ronnie might find a way to start a conversation that could change the way that I'm really focusing on my retirement. Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you, Ronnie. Appreciate it. 1967. Man, that was a big year. Where did you start?
Santa Barbara, California.
Santa Barbara for the local government? And did you stay there the whole time?
No, actually, I was in the insurance business in 1997.
Okay. What insurance side?
College seniors.
Yeah. So Santa Barbara in 67, that's a pretty fascinating time to be down there. I'm sure, find Ronnie and he's going to have some stories for you on that. All right. I think. I don't know. There's all sorts of things we can learn from Ronnie. All right, tell a story that sticks. Okay, so you all know, and by the way, I should plug, so we've got the Washington update coming up. Right after this, there's a break, and then the sort of lay of the land, regulatory structure, all that stuff. But then after that, there's 3 breakouts. And I don't want to play preferential treatment, but there's one breakout that is focused on communication. And I highly recommend that one because it's going to be a lot more tactical for you all in terms of how do I actually do this in an email? How do I do this when I only have a half hour in an orientation or whatever the channels that you have to communicate with people? I think that session will really help bring this and put the conversation to a practical place. Cool? So plug on that. But one of the things that they're talking about, and I'm going to over-communicate on here, is that we are in a situation right now, and you all know this, where there is a war for attention that's going on with anybody who's engaging at the workplace and outside. And what the differentiating factor is now, it used to be that inside organizations we had a monopoly on attention. Because before the internet and things like that, there was actually no opportunity to engage outside media content at work. You might watch a significant world event on a television. Was anybody in school or at work when you would actually turn on a live broadcast of space launches or other big activities? War is another one we used to focus on. So you would localize the outside content to a significant historical event, but everything else was internal. And so whether it was a town hall from the leader or a memo that went out, or eventually, and this is when it got sketchy, into email territory, you had a captive audience. And so the bar for communication was pretty darn low. You basically just had to say what was going on, what we're going to do, and all that stuff. Okay, so technology's given us so many great things, but one of the downsides for folks like us who are trying to capture the attention of employees is that it's also raised the bar for how we have to communicate. Because no longer is there a firewall. Once I go inside work, I can't engage any outside content. Now, once I go inside work, I can get everything that I got on the outside, including Instagram or Facebook or news or videos on YouTube, whatever it is, there's an opportunity to engage. And so if my content that I'm pushing in an email, or my content that I'm pushing in a town hall experience, or a memo, or a poster on the wall, is significantly worse than what they're getting on their other device, guess what they're going to do? They're going to engage the stuff that's on the device. And so the only way that people like us can actually differentiate ourselves in those environments is we don't have the ability to develop all the flashy videos that they're seeing or any number of graphics that are going to compete with the market. We can't play in that space. But what we can do is tell stories that are compelling. And so when you look at how you could do that, you have to tell a story that sticks. So think about your people and tell their stories. And I know sometimes it can get tricky, but this is the most powerful thing that people in your position can do, is find somebody who's representative of the population in which you're working and tell their story and celebrate it. Ronnie could tell us right now 50 stories based on a particular topic. If I was like, Ronnie, somebody who should have thought more about retirement and then regretted it, I mean, there might be more than 50 in that category. Or somebody who was really proactive and took some steps early on and look at what they're doing now. Those stories are really, really powerful, and they're a way that you can engage people. Because even though it's not flashy and it's not digital and all that stuff, it's your opportunity to engage. And the reason is because of all that brain science. Because once I start telling a story about somebody, you listen. It's a weird thing. I don't know, but that's the secret power that you have. So this one right here is a famous example. It's attributed to Hemingway, but he probably actually didn't write it. Who knows who actually did, but it's a really interesting example. The story goes that he was sitting with a bunch of other authors, and they were having basically a debate over how long a story should be, and he said, I think a story should just be 6 words. They said, Hemingway, you're drunk. He absolutely was, but secondarily, they said that, let's see it. And so he said, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. Okay. 6 words invite so many questions. So many questions come from those 6 words. Why did I buy baby shoes? Why were they never worn? What happened? And there's a flood of human emotions that can come along with 6 words. And so what I would encourage you to do is, it's funny, everything gets interesting the more you look at it, right? And so when you're in your industry, in your area, you might look at retirement and have people look back at you with glass glazed eyes, and they have no clue what you're talking about. Because it's technical jargon, it's financial, which is already above the head of most people, and it is in a spot where they're just not seeing the importance. If you can tell a story that invites the same amount of interest and questions that something like this does, what could happen? Okay. So before we get to a place where we're going to do Q&A, and we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so that's good, I want to go back to that Saudi Arabian example. Has anybody ever heard that story before? Nope. Well, that's good. Now you have. Does anybody know, and I'm assuming not since we haven't heard it, the name of the man who led that construction crew? Nope. Okay. The name of the man that led that construction crew was Mohammed bin Laden. And so now we might know who that is because he became a national hero in Saudi Arabia. A national hero who really grew a billion-dollar enterprise in construction and was celebrated for uniting the kingdom. And unfortunately for us, especially in this week, when we look at his legacy, we don't remember that. Because what we remember is what his eighth son did on September 11th. And so when you think about that, why does that matter? Well, first of all, on Wednesday, you have an incredibly powerful speaker who personally experienced that in a way that nobody else could imagine. But you think about what story does and where they end, and it's just fascinating. And so the question I leave you with before we get rolling here is, what can your story do for your people? And hopefully you can tell it. Okay, Miss Tracy, are we ready to open it up for Q&A?
All right. How do you tell a story that everyone can relate to?
What?
How do you tell a story that everyone can relate to?
Okay, great. How do you tell a story that everyone can relate to? Interesting, right? Because the way we just talked about it is that we have to put people as a sort of main character in their own story. And so if you want to look for the stories that are generalizable, you have to look for the qualities that those people share. And so in an organization, and we could take an example, whether it's federal government where I spent my time, or in local or state, what are the common threads that are identifiers of this population? Because what's beautiful for you all is that when you work in a place, you define a culture. And that culture is built around common norms and tenets of who we are as collectively. And so you have to find those so you can tell a story that applies to those. So if I was going to tell a story at the Pentagon, what I would do is over-index on the elements of the Pentagon that made us who we were. So we had a strong sense of patriotism. We had a big can-do-it attitude. And we were respectful mostly of authority, although that maybe doesn't apply because I saw some things in the Pentagon, boy, that was something. But with those things, what could I do? Well, if I know that this is an organization that respects authority, that can shape the way I communicate. I want to use a confident tone. If I know that we have a strong patriotic tense, I'm going to not just focus on what this means for you, but what this means for your family and more generalities, the country. And I know it feels really big and scary, but there are things that define your people, and you can focus on those to tell a story that applies.
Are there any storytelling pitfalls that we should avoid?
Yeah, storytelling pitfalls you should avoid. Absolutely. Never lead with your story is the first one. That's the most common thing, is that people will automatically put themselves in the shoes of the main character, and they'll tell you, well, when I was doing my defined contributions 27 years ago, I thought that it was this. And what happens is that you can actually make assumptions that aren't true about your audience. So the most powerful thing you could do in that case is just continue to ask those questions so you understand who they are and what their story is. That would probably be the biggest thing, is don't make assumptions. And then the second is, it's really dangerous if you don't follow the curve and you just tell a story that goes like this, which is what most corporate email, government email, it's just like this, right? And so the question is, if my subject line reads something like 2020 open enrollment season on the way, and then it opens with greetings employees, really excited to announce that we now have once again an opportunity to re-examine our retirement, and I think it's going to be a really great thing for all of you. So let's talk through the minutia, and then by paragraph 7, if there's anybody still reading, and by the way, I used to do this when I would work with some clients, is embed little sentences in there to see if anybody was reading. It's fascinating. Actually, there's a company that did this. with terms of service agreements, because sometimes our emails start to feel as long as those. And if you look at the average length of a terms of service agreement, they're like roughly 20,000 to 17,000 words. And if 20,000 words is about the size of Macbeth, written by Shakespeare, and if you want to talk about which was more historically significant, we could have that debate. But in those 20,000 words, there was a company called PC Pitstop, and like midway through, they embedded a clause that said, if you're reading this, I'll send you $1,000 right now. All you have to do is email your address to this email address. Took 3,000 downloads in 4 months to do it. So when you're looking at pitfalls, that's probably the biggest one, is just don't make boring stuff. Okay.
How do you build a story to attract attention for all groups of age, race, and gender?
Oh, very good. How do you build a story to attract attention for all groups of age, race, and gender? So we all understand that the future of work, and if we look at common trends, and certainly corporate America, but in government too, diversity and inclusion is a big topic right now. And it's a big topic, by the way, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's actually the best thing to do. And just quick sidebar on that, the reason it's the best thing to do is not because it creates cohesion necessarily, but because it creates conflict. Not a conflict of people, but a conflict of ideas. And if you look at all the great achievements, it's when we challenge ourselves and we push ideas to the next level. And there's something special about when we don't come from the same place as people who are in a room with us, how much we challenge the ideas of those people, and it can be constructive. Anyway, parking that and then getting to a place where we're asking, how do we tell a story that resonates with all those people? And I think you circle back to what makes us the same here. And it's going to be something about your culture at work that you can double down on. And so if you looked at Amazon, they have actual core tenets, 10 of them, that they focus on. And so I would look at that organization, and I would say, cool, they have a principle called disagree and commit. And the idea is that when a leader says, I got it, I heard the disagreement, but we're going to go forward, that is well respected. I would double down on that principle. In your organization, you might have something else that is representative of who you are. And I would actually challenge you to find it. And if you want to know how you can find it, there's a behavioral psychologist named Adam Grant, and he has a great way. Ask people, what's one thing that happens here that doesn't happen anywhere else? I'll say it again. What's one thing that happens here that doesn't happen anywhere else? That is the only way you can approximate your culture. Ask that to a bunch of people you work with, and you will understand what that culture really is all about. Take those things and use them to shape your story, regardless of race, gender, age, all that.
How many stories are too many? Is there a limit to when you would lose the connection with the audience?
Okay, man, I tell you, I spent too many years playing the band without earplugs. What was that?
How many stories are too many? Is there a point at which you would lose connection with the audience?
You tell me, did I lose your connection yet? Because I might have told too many today. Let's see. How many stories are too many? I think you have to read your audience on that one, but I can tell you this. If you're really telling somebody else's story, and you're really putting them in the role of the main character or the person they care about the most, you will never tire them out, because we love to hear our own stories. And so that would probably be the biggest thing that you can do. Now, more tactically, if you look at the channels that you're actually working with, that's where we get into a place where we are under an assault with emails. I'm certain that's not, a new surprise for any of you. We are in a place where there's more coming at us than ever before. And so then, in that context, the question is not how much, but how good can you be? Because I promise you this, if you have a subject line that says, I'd like to tell you a story, ... everyone will open that thing. Or any number of other creative things. And then you follow it up with, and I know it can get sensitive, you can't tell specific people's story, but I'd like to tell you a story about, a 57-year-old employee that I once knew. Boom. And that content will convey more meaning and purpose, and then it won't matter how many times you tell it, because it's actually so much more compelling than anything else that's coming through that channel.
How do you get participants to tell you their story in a 20 to 30 minute appointment?
Oh, 20 to 30 minute appointment, how do you get participants to tell their story? That's good. Let's think about the question that you would ask. And I think you could go back to those three that are on the slide without actually asking it. Ask them something about, what are you in this for? When you think about retirement, who is the most important person? Is it you, your family, your kids, whoever that is? Get that. Second is, what goal are you pursuing? And again, this gets back to, in 30 years, what are we doing? Are we a famous novelist like Kurt Vonnegut? Cool. Well, let's at least get you some security with a retirement package. And find out what the goal they're pursuing. And the third is, what challenges are they facing in getting that? I feel like you could use those three and get to a pretty good spot.
Are stories with positive endings more impactful?
Oh, stories with positive endings more impactful. Again, I think on the whole, yes, absolutely. It's all about the relativity, as Vonnegut said, and I'll go back to this. So I'm a big Cold War guy, which means that I think Rocky IV was probably the best movie ever created. And not just for the cinematic excellence of that, but because of the cultural impact it had, right? And I mean, I tell you what, watching Rocky Balboa after his best friend was killed, go and say, not only I will challenge you, but I will challenge you in the Soviet Union, and then cue up a montage where he's carrying a log, doing lunges through like 3 feet of snow and doing sit-ups from the rafters, and then gets into the arena, and he's in a spot where there are no odds that could be bigger against him right now, because he's got 12,000 Russians who are booing him. He's got a Soviet-engineered human being who has already killed his friend, and he's in a spot of utter despair. And I ask you this, Tracy, if we had not gotten to a place where Rocky went the distance, and Rocky won that thing, and Rocky said at the end, it's better you and me than 20 million, because if he can change and I can change, we all can change. If we hadn't ended like that, it wouldn't be the best movie that ever existed, and it wouldn't have single-handedly ended the Cold War. So to answer your question, I absolutely think you want to end with positivity.
Okay. How important is data in a story to make it stick?
How important
is data? How important is data?
Data's interesting. Data, yes. So be careful with data. And the reason you can be careful with data is because data is all about the analytical neocortex. That stuff sticks for 2 days for your average audience. And so, yes, it's important, but behind every major figure, is there a story that you can bring that to life with? And I think you could always say, I'm going to tell you a stat, but then I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a stat, and I'll tell you a story. And if you look at, like, anybody from Missouri, Iowa, yeah? Illinois-ish, not Chicago, but like rural Midwest. This is, all right, there we go. We got one person, that's great. One person from the Midwest, yeah, right, okay. But I'll tell you this, Midwest people know how to do this. It's something in their blood, and they just are so good, and probably too good if you ask most people who have to listen to them, at telling stories. And they pair a fact with a story. So that's what I would do.
What's the best way to tell a story to an uninterested group?
An uninterested group? Well, I'm doing it right now. No, I'm just joking. That's good. No, not at all. You guys are great. The best way to tell a story, I think you have to flip the script in some way. Flip the script in some way, because by the time they've come to encounter you, let's say you're in a room, would the context here be new employees, or what would the actual context be? Can I ask one follow-up question?
Sure.
Anybody know, what would it be when you've got a group in front of you who's uninterested and you're the presenter? Oh, come on. Say what? Okay.
New hires.
New hires. Let's say new hires. New hires who are like, whew. Government onboarding, by the way, is one of the most, well, I'll just comment on federal government onboarding. It was one of the most hilarious journeys I've ever been on, because they basically couldn't give me computer access for 2 weeks, and they just handed me a binder that was like 500 pages, and they said, read about this. And then I went and sat next to this guy. His name was Bill, and I was so pumped and so excited. And I was like, Bill, I'm just so honored to be here. I'm a real patriot, and I love America, and I'm excited to work for this administration. And he said, yeah, I got it. Hey, let me tell you something real quick. I was like, yeah, Bill, anything you say. You've been here 30 years. And he said, good. Listen close then. This organization is a big old train. And he's like, you can get in front of it and try and slow it down, but we're just going to run you over. And he's like, similarly, you can get behind it to try and move it a little faster. You're just going to throw your back out and not going anywhere. So what I would do is sit right on that train and go for a little ride. And he's been doing that for 30 years. Okay. So let's say you got a bunch of Bills in a room and they're a little skeptical. What you got to do is flip that script. What's a way you can surprise them and say something or do something that they didn't necessarily expect? And that is really something that takes a little creativity on your part, but it can be as simple as, I just want to tell you a story right now about retirement and what I've seen here. And Ronnie, on the other hand, doesn't even have to do that. He could just do an Elvis impersonation thing where the lyrics relate to retirement. Whatever that thing is for you, make it interesting and defy their expectations, because once you did that, then you created an opportunity for them to engage.
Does storytelling content differ with generations, baby boomers compared to Gen Z?
Yeah, great question. Does storytelling content differ by generation? And I don't know, because I'm still stuck in the greatest generation and up till 1989 with Rocky, and then I kind of checked out at that point. So for anybody who's in that world, absolutely, let's talk about patriotism and this country. But I think yes, certainly. And the things that change are not the shapes, they're not the types of stories, it's just the characters. And so if you can identify yourself, and it doesn't mean you're going to have to be fluent in Kanye or any number of different like text abbreviations that I just think are a violent abuse of the English language, anything like that, all you have to do is just understand what's culturally relevant to people, and then just know this: if you tell a story that resonates with their journey, it actually won't matter what time period it comes from, because we just love to think and see ourselves in the characters of the stories we hear.
How long or how short should a story be to keep the interest of your audience?
This is an interesting point. If you ask a lot of people who are in sort of content marketing or in the space of trying to get attention, they will tell you keep it as short as possible. I would say that with a caveat. You can take as much time as you need if the story is good enough. So it's kind of a little graph where the quality of the story gives you a little bit more length. And so if we're in a room, 5 minutes, you should be able to tell a pretty good story. And people will stay engaged because they're not expecting you to do that. If we're in writing, 700 to 1,000 words, I know we're a little tactical right now, but that amount should be able to get you basically any story, and it just takes a lot of time to be able to do it.
What's the best way to deal with an argumentative or defensive audience?
Oh, I love the argument and defensive audience. And normally, I look in the room for it's usually a guy who's like, and there might be a few of you, but I can't see you as well. And the reason, and see, here's this guy, poor guy, crosses his arms, and now we're calling him out. Don't worry, I know it's not you. You're smiling. It's great. What you got to do is find a way to diffuse, and now, there you go. Yeah, there it is. Diffuse your audience. So look for the ones who are most skeptical and break them down. And the way you break them down is you engage them directly, not confrontationally, but pretend like they're your biggest fan, and go to them and say, okay, for example, if you have a question about, like what retirement means to them, ask that person first. And you will see that if you can bring in an incredible amount of energy, tell an interesting story as a hook, and engage those skeptics directly, the social pressures, you will win that room. Because everybody's in their corner of their eye seeing that skeptical person, and it's shaping them in a way that you don't understand. And if you flip them, you flip the room. Okay.
Is it best to end the story with a solution or a burning question?
Oh, that's good. There's an idea in a book called Power of Moments called Trip Them with the Truth. And so the question was, is it best to end with a successful solution or an intriguing question? And I would say it depends on the story, and I know it's a cop-out, but I will say this. The idea that you can get somebody to discover a truth will be so much more powerful than you telling them that. So if you have a story where you get to a place where there's an obvious answer, don't say what that is. You could even ask a question, what do you think would be the best idea for this person that we've just been talking about? And if they can get to a place where they see the value, you will have that stick way more. So actually, the question can be the most powerful thing. Great question.
How frequently should we try to tell our story?
How frequently should we what?
Try to tell our story.
Oh, interesting. How frequently should we try to tell our story? I think you could do it when you're talking about why. And Ronnie, I'm just picking on you just because you're here, and not at all, I'm celebrating you. I mean, this is awesome, but when Ronnie's got the experience that he's got and a compelling story to tell, when you talk about why you're in this business, I think that would be your opportunity, because there are so few people who care about what you care about, that if you can demonstrate a real passion in that first moment, when you say, let me tell you why this matters. I'm not here to sit on the train of bureaucracy for 30 years. I'm here because I've watched lives transformed over generations. I'm here because I've learned about what regret looks like when you look backwards instead of forwards. And I'm very concerned for the future of everyone in this room right now. And I think that's why you should care about retirement and defined contributions. And it may be boring, but I can promise you this, it'll be one of the most important decisions you ever make. If you can do something like that up front, that would be powerful. And are we okay on time? Mm-hmm. Okay.
How does the short attention span of social media affect the ability to engage an audience through storytelling?
Yeah, social media is, maybe I should have been born in another generation. I'm not a huge fan of it, clearly. And so the question is, if you look at human attention, people have done the studies now, we're becoming, I think, even worse than goldfish now, because we got to a place where it was like we're right at 7 seconds where we can maintain our attention on a singular task, but I think we're slipping. And so what you've got is, if you look at social media and a lot of modern technology, it was wired to short circuit our brain. So tomorrow when you're talking behavioral economics and the user experience and how you design interfaces and things, that's what's going on. And we've all heard this stuff where Twitter and Instagram and Facebook were wired to mirror the same sort of qualities of a slot machine. And so that's why the notifications pop up in red. That's why there's little spinning wheels that you wait for to get it. And so what's happened when we create addictive technology like that is it degrades our ability to concentrate. And so then the question is so good. What do you do when you're in a room full of goldfish who are maybe not even the smartest goldfish in that opportunity? I think the chance is, and this is what no one seems to fully understand, is that if you start telling a story, people will pay attention. There's nobody who was listening to this Rocky Balboa spiel and halfway through was like, I don't care, watching that movie. And if you were, then just get on out of here because we don't have time for you. If you tell a story, all the brain science activates. But if you're trying to play the game of, let me get all the catchy headers and the flashy stuff, you're going to lose because there's people who are far more creative than all of us who are trying to engineer that. So just stick with the story.
What are some examples of starting the why?
Oh, examples of starting with why. I love this. And I think, let's think about it in your case in particular. And this, again, comes back kind of like what we were talking about with Ronnie. If you can tell somebody why you personally are in this business, and I know it might sound weird because I was like, hey, you should tell their story. Absolutely. But they're going to care why you're sitting there. And so let's say it's a group of new hires, and they've been running through, like, okay, you got to meet with HR, here you got your computer, meet with IT, and then, oh, yep, go meet those benefit folks. When you are sitting in front of them, if you can flip the script by doing exactly this, which is to say, before we get started, I need to tell you all something about me. I'm in this business not because I need a paycheck. I'm not in this business because I think that benefits are the most exciting thing in the entire world and all I do is read about the nuances of every single plan. I'm in this business because of people like you. And so why we're here today, I need you to know that I've seen this movie before. I've seen people like you and what happens when we don't focus on retirement. I've seen people like you and what happens when we do. And so what I'd love to do is convey to you today what this could mean for your future. And then you could shift into a place where you're understanding their story.
How can a company tell its story that challenges the masses?
Oh, how can companies do that? interesting. How can companies tell a story that challenges the masses? This is an interesting point, and you're seeing it a lot now. The companies that win are the ones that take a stand. They believe in something. And so what we forget is, in the 70s, we had something called agency theory that came up in economics, particularly for publicly traded companies. And that's when the idea that shareholder value preceded all else came about. And we started making short-term decisions and investments in the name of profit and not necessarily in the name of people or communities. That's relatively new. That came about in the late 70s and went through the 80s and 90s into today. And what we're seeing is that we're actually going to reconnect with what organizations used to be about. So if you look at the titans of industry, while there were labor disputes and things like that, the thing that differentiated them and made them what they were is they believed in something. And so with this question, it's important for an organization to know what they believe in and to say it. And to know that by saying it, it may not be for everyone. Because when you do that, you connect with people in a way that you just can't do when you're pushing watered down stuff. So what I would say, if you're in a company, find out what you believe in, and if it's controversial, that's okay, and stand on that. Cool. All right. Thank you all so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. Have fun, and thank you for what you do for this country.